Welcome to Insights and Indicators. I'm Jason Thomas, Carlyle's head of global research and investment strategy. And in this podcast, I share observations and opinions on the economic landscape, as well as insights from research being conducted by our team here at Carlyle. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-chairman of Carlyle. In addition to responsibilities at our firm, he's also a philanthropist, published author of several books, most recently, The Highest Calling, Conversations on the American Presidency. He's a television show host and also principal owner of the Baltimore Orioles. I'm honored to have him today. This episode was recorded on November 26th, 2024, and the discussion reflects composite portfolio data and analysis of recent government reports that are accurate as of that date. Before turning to David, I just wanted to say a word about the global economy. I think today there's a temptation to skip ahead into 2025 and to focus on the potential policy changes introduced by the incoming administration. But before doing that, I do think it's worth taking stock of initial conditions. Indeed, I think the big problem, or what really seeded some of the policy mistakes 4 years ago from the Fed, was a failure to mark to market or to understand how conditions in December 2020, January 2021 differed markedly from expectations as of June of that year. For example, in June 2020, the Fed expected the economy during the pandemic to contract by 6.5%. As it turned out, the economy was only 1.5% smaller at the end of 2020 than it was at the start of the year. But there was no adjustment in policy, even as the economic numbers came in much better than expected. And so today, again, before President Trump takes office, you have an economy that since the start of 2023 has endured real interest rates that have averaged more than 2%. That's up markedly from the negative real interest rates that persisted for much of the decade between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. In fact, back then, if you would have thought that 2% real interest rates would have had a really devastating effect on economic activity. Indeed, in 2018, it didn't look like the US economy could even handle real interest rates that were about 0.5%. But yet, over this time, the US economy has grown at an average annualized rate of nearly 3%. Annual growth in US labor productivity has exceeded 2% for 5 consecutive quarters. And it looks like we're going to finish 2024 with core inflation, based on the Fed's preferred measure, that remains closer to 3% than to 2%. So I think in sum, this is an economy that is clearly not screaming for rate cuts. I think it's very likely that the Fed decides to pause in December. Again, taking stock of current conditions, the 3 rate cuts in 25 basis point increments that have occurred thus far, and take a wait and see approach to see how the policy environment unfolds, to see where the economy goes from here. But I think that this is a time where people are starting to talk about the upward risk to interest rates, upward risk to yields. But to me, it's more of a time when the past expectations for the substantial decline in base rates, for a substantial reduction in long-term bond yields, is now coming to terms with the reality that in the post-pandemic period, we do seem to have encountered a structural break where that very low growth, low productivity, low inflation, low interest rate regime that characterized the economy for much of the past decade is now very much a thing of the past. And so even before we take into account what's likely to come, and I look forward to asking David about that, we should, again, just appreciate the extent to which the current economy does not very much resemble that we'd grown used to in that prior decade. So David, thank you so much for joining me. This is a great thrill for me. I just want to start with your takeaways from the election. How surprising do you think that this result was now that you've had a chance to look at the results? Virtually all of the votes have been counted at this point.
Well, it's clear that the polling industry doesn't use artificial intelligence to get its data correct. I think most pollsters were not accurate. They generally thought it was going to be a very, very close election. And if you recall, right before the polling and the voting actually occurred, it was generally the case that people thought that Kamala Harris would get a majority of the popular vote. Maybe not a majority of the electoral vote, but certainly a majority of the popular vote, as many polls said, not all, right before. As it turned out, she didn't get a majority of the popular vote. She lost the popular vote, and she obviously lost the electoral vote. So I think what happened is many people who were Trump voters didn't tell pollsters that they really were going to vote for Trump. Secondly, many of her voters who said in polls that they were going to vote for her didn't show up. And so the surprising results are things like this. The Latino vote, which historically is fairly Democratic, was, while Democratic this time, not as much so as before. It's also the case that while Trump won a majority of the popular vote, in fact, he didn't do it by an overwhelming amount. When you think about it, 210,000 votes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania been different. 210,000 people had voted for Trump, voted for Kamala Harris. She would have won those three states, and she would have won the election. So there's no doubt that Trump won. Nobody's contesting the election. I think in hindsight, the Democrats probably underestimated how serious the inflation problem was, how serious the immigration problem was, and how serious it was to bring a new candidate onto the scene with 105 days to go, somebody who was not that well known by the public and not all that respected as vice president, rightly or wrongly. So my takeaway is that Trump deserves a lot of credit for coming back from the political dead. Think about this. Not since Napoleon was sent to Elba was anybody come back in power with such a degree of handicaps facing him. When Napoleon was sent to Elba, people thought he was dead and gone. When Trump went to Mar-a-Lago after the last election, people thought he was dead and gone. And then that was compounded by the fact he was impeached. He had 5 indictments, 2 civil trials against him, and 1 criminal trial against him, 34 counts on the criminal trial. And despite all of that, he came back from the political dead. You have to hand it to him for persistence and for the dedication of his supporters to staying with him despite all those problems.
One thing, both of us live in Washington, D.C., and one thing that I've noticed in the aftermath of this election is there's really not the same level of anxiety or unease that characterized 2016. I think at that time, people were really pretty exercised, couldn't believe this had happened. Do you feel the same thing? And how do you explain that? The sort of, I don't want to say contentment, but there does seem to be an acceptance that didn't exist in this town 8 years ago.
Yes, I agree. When Trump was elected the first time, he was the first person who was elected president of the United States who had no government experience at all. And people were nervous about that. But he did bring in people who had fairly establishment ties, people who were well respected. This time, you would think there'd be more anxiety, though I don't really see it except for a few nominees, because they know that Trump has been president before and they kind of know what he is and what he isn't. This time, he's bringing into the cabinet and to the White House staff people who are pretty much loyalists, people who are really depending on him and really he helped make in many cases, or who he knows are absolutely loyal to him. So it's going to be a different kind of administration. We haven't seen any president have such absolute loyalists in his cabinet before. Remember the famous book, Team of Rivals, written by Doris Kearns Goodwin. That book talks about how Lincoln put in his cabinet people who had run for president against him. Here, you've got a person elected president of the United States, and he's got nobody that was politically against him. Everybody is completely a team of loyalists, not a team of rivals. So we'll see whether loyalists who believe so strongly in Donald Trump and his principles can get the government to do what they want. We don't know yet, but it's an interesting test.
And so it's a common phrase in Washington that personnel is policy. And, so loyalists, that would imply that they're going to closely adhere to what President Trump promised on the campaign trail. But as you know, following the campaign, it seems unlikely that he could deliver on every promise. I mean, there was a tax cut, almost a bespoke tax cut, it seemed, for every state that he visited. And, I guess 8 years ago, it was said that President Trump should be taken seriously, but not literally. What does this administration staffing imply about the policy mix going forward, in your view?
Well, I think everybody who's very loyal to him and has basically paid homage to him, are going to be the ones who are in the cabinet and the White House staff. But one of his choices, the Secretary for Treasury, Scott Bessent, has said cleverly that the tariff position is a maximalist position, which means we're going to have these high tariffs. If we have to get there, we can start at lower tariffs. And so I think what Scott Bessent was trying to do is walk back the very high tariffs that Trump promised and maybe get to those positions if we need to. But on some of the things, I think Trump is absolutely going to go ahead with. The tax cut, he has to really do it. Otherwise, he wants to have tax increases because the tax cut that he got when he was president expires next year. And so if it's not renewed in some form or another, people who benefited from that tax cut are going to see big tax increases. So I suspect he will go through with some form of that. But as you know, tax legislation is usually written in the Congress, not in the White House or the Treasury. And so we'll see a lot of amendments, a lot of things that we didn't anticipate getting put in at the last minute. On tariffs, President Trump clearly loves tariffs because you can do it by a stroke of a pen. And therefore, he doesn't have to deal with Congress in that respect. I think you're going to no doubt get some tariffs, but it may not be as high as initially promised. I think many of the things he talked about in terms of foreign policy, we don't know when he's going to get to do that. Ending the war in Russia, Ukraine in 24 hours may be difficult, but again, he didn't say which 24 hours. It could be 24 hours down the road. So it may happen. I suspect he will get a deal there, but I suspect it'll take about 6 months to get done. I think in the Middle East, he's got very good ties in parts of the Arab world, very good ties in Israel. I suspect some deal will probably get done there within 6 months or so. The biggest challenges he faces, I think, are that right now he's got many people around the world who are skeptical of him. People in Europe have been skeptical from time to time. People in China are trying to wonder whether he's going to be tougher than Biden or tougher than he was before. There are many people on our borders, the Canadian and Mexican borders, who are nervous about some of the things he's saying, particularly those in Mexico who are worried about whether the deportation efforts that he said he's going to have are going to actually come to pass. Deportation is complicated for sure. And as you know, Elon Musk is leading an effort to make government more efficient. And he said he's going to take $2 trillion out of our $6.5 trillion budget. That's very difficult to do because, as you know, 90% of the budget is entitlements or defense spending or interest payments. So you're not going to pay the entitlements, you're not going to pay the interest payments, you're not going to pay defense spending. If you don't do that, you've got big problems. So I don't know if you can really get $2 trillion out of a budget. Getting costs out of a private sector company is a little bit easier than getting costs out of a government related budget because everybody has support for certain amounts of spending in the government. And it's not that easy to get these numbers reduced, but we'll see what happens.
Just a final question. When you're traveling around the world and talking to people, you mentioned the anxiety, the uncertainty. What would you recommend for the way that foreign leaders or others should be approaching President Trump? I don't think there's any surprise as it relates to the 10% incremental tariffs on China, but in those two Truth Social posts, he also suggested 25% tariffs on both Canada and Mexico, obviously our neighbors, in some ways, integrated economies, integrated supply chains. This, I think, has come as a bit of a shock. People expected perhaps there'd be the wait or delay until there's the renegotiation of the USMCA at the end of next year. Again, how would you advise foreign leaders, diplomats in this new second Trump administration?
Well, in the second term of a president, historically, the people who serve in the first term, they often stay for a while and they're tired. And you see a lot of mistakes made in second terms. Look what happened to Richard Nixon in his second term, Ronald Reagan his second term, Bill Clinton his second term. So it's not easy to have a second term. Now we're going to test whether a second term that's not consecutive produces fresh people with a lot of energy and really a recharged president of the United States because he's tired as well. So I suspect that it will be different than a president who has two consecutive terms. But I would advise people this. In the first term, I don't think that many foreign leaders took Donald Trump that seriously. They thought he was a real estate developer, not that sophisticated in policy matters. And then they realized that he's very strong in what he believes in, and he will fight for what he believes in. So I think this time around, take him very seriously, take his advisors very seriously. I think you have to spend time with him, develop a relationship with him. And I think if you spend time with him and you're able to develop a relationship, I think you can get more out of things than you can by just throwing lobs in from overseas or so. He's a person that wants to be taken seriously and should be taken seriously. And I think he's going to try to do a lot of what he said he's going to do in the campaign. He recognizes it's not easy to get everything done. But I think any foreign leader that doesn't take him seriously or doesn't take his proposal seriously, I think is making a big mistake for their country.
Well, David, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join me.
Thank you.
And thank you for your insights.
My pleasure.
On behalf of the team here at Carlisle, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of Insights and Indicators.